So this morning we did a training on natural hazard disclosures. A company that we work with often called HomeGuard actually came out and did a Zoom session with us to go through the reports. These are actually very important and they come out, they're a part of every transaction that we do, but still oftentimes I think for buyers and sellers, sometimes we don't really go into them in much detail. So we made sure to provide the recording for the sake of our agents, but also I thought it would be a really good one to share with the rest of our community. Hope you enjoy.
So yeah, my name is Ted Stephanos, and I've been with HomeGuard for nearly 15 years, but I've been in the field of natural hazard disclosure for nearly 30 years. So basically my whole professional life been dealing with natural hazards and involved in the industry. So, when I first started, the report was like a one-page report that just covered like earthquake fault zones and FEMA flood zones. And now, as you well know, it's a 35, 40-page report, things that go way beyond the scope of natural hazards. So one thing it's important to do is to keep real estate agents up to date on new things going on in the industry, but also just a refresher course. If you've been in the industry or if you're new to the industry, it's a great presentation on how to read and interpret the report. And an important thing is just reducing your liability, by deferring it to us to answer your questions and to get the report taken care of. So one thing we like to do is to go through the whole report. And without having the history of natural hazards in California, we wouldn't have natural hazard disclosure. So in 1968 is when the FEMA established the National Flood Insurance Program, and it was a way for homeowners to insure themselves against the dangers of flooding and the cost of flood damage. So this also became a disclosure requirement in at that time as well. Now, the Alcos-Perillo Earthquake Fault Special Studies Zone Act at the time, now it's called the Earthquake Fault Zone Act, that was established in California in 1972 after the Silmar earthquake in 1971 in Los Angeles. And that really changed building codes in the state. And we'll get into the details of that in a little bit. The Seismic Hazard Mapping Act was established in 1991 after the Loma Prieta earthquake. So again, without these earthquakes and major hazards occurring in California, we wouldn't have the subsequent legislation. And that was an effort to map out seismic hazards such as landslides and liquefaction hazards. And then we had the NHD statement that took effect in 1998. And this is when compliance went almost to 100% with the real estate agents to start ordering NHD reports. Prior to that time, it was still pretty simple. There weren't too many things to put in the report. And a lot of agents would even do it on their own and fill out the questionnaire or the statement. But now, after 1998, a lot more things got added in, and we'll get into those details. So these are the 6 parts of the natural hazard disclosure statement. The first 2 are related to flooding. The second 2 are related to fire, and then the last 2 are related to seismic hazards. So in detail, the special flood hazard zones, this is, like I said, established back in 1968. And this is defining the 1% flood hazard zones, or what are called zone A's or 100-year flood zones. So any place that it has been determined that could flood once every 100 years on average would be considered in a FEMA flood hazard zone. So this is really important from a buyer standpoint, because this could dictate whether or not the lender is going to require flood insurance if you have a loan. And that could be pretty costly, somewhere between $1,000 to $1,500 a year that the homeowners are going to be paying in flood insurance. And there really isn't much you can do about it if your structure is in a flood zone. The only way to do it is to literally raise your foundation up so it's above the base flood elevation. But there are loopholes, because if you can show the lender that the actual structure is not in the flood zone, even though part of the property is in the flood zone, then there are loopholes in that you can get a waiver called a letter of map amendment. So, for example, on this map right here, you have these homes that would, the property line may back up into this blue area, which is the FEMA flood zone. So the report would reflect within a 100-year flood zone because all NHD companies are looking at the property boundary line. We don't really know, or it doesn't affect the report if there's a house there or if it's vacant land. We kind of treat it the same way because we're looking at the parcel boundary lines. So you could have a small portion of the property in a FEMA flood zone, and it's going to come back. The NHD report will come back as checked yes for special flood hazard zone. Now, again, it's up to the lender to decide whether or not they're going to carry or require flood insurance. But like I said, if they do, say it's a situation where 40% of the back portion of the property is in a flood zone, chances are the lender's going to require flood insurance, or they're going to prove to you, or they're going to have you prove to them that the structure is not in the flood zone. So that's when surveyors can get involved and what's called the letter of map amendment. So what a surveyor can do is provide an elevation certificate, and that's when they come out to the property and they shoot precise elevations of what's called the lowest adjacent grade, which is the lowest elevation where the foundation touches the ground. And if that elevation is even 1/10 of a foot above the base flood elevation, then you can apply for a LOMA and get that waived. And lenders will accept the letters of map amendment. So this is also the case for newer homes that are built within flood hazard zones, because if you have a new home or a home that, or like even a vacant land, and you're deciding you want to build a structure on there, but it's in a flood zone, what the city is going to require you to do is bring in fill and elevate the pad so the structure's sitting at an elevation above the base flood elevation. And that's totally legal. We see that happen quite a bit in flood-prone communities. There were, around the Great Mall in Milpitas, there were quite a few townhomes built several years ago, which are still in a flood zone, but they built so much, I think they brought in about 7 feet of fill to build the pads of those condos up above the base flood elevation. So theoretically, if it floods in that area, according to Army Corps of Engineers specifics, those condos would be dry. There'd be kind of an island. The streets in the area might be flooded, but again, you're only insuring the structure. You're not insuring the land. So, so that's we don't do elevation certificates at HomeGuard, but any licensed surveyor should be able to provide that service. So that's the loophole when it comes to flood hazard zones. So the other hazard related to disclosure in relating to flooding is the dam failure inundation areas. So the state has undergone a pretty massive update project back in 2017 due to Senate Bill 92 passing, and it requires the dam owners to update their dam failure inundation maps. So to date, there's been nearly 600 maps, 600 reservoirs that have been updated. There's still about another 650 to go, because in California, we have a lot of reservoirs. Almost every sizable body of water is man-made lake. Lake Tahoe is natural, and so is Clear Lake. But other than that, almost every sizable body of water is man-made. So there's a lot of dams in California. We have a lot of aging infrastructure too. So it's important to to monitor the dams for seismic integrity, any engineering defects and things like that. So now flood insurance is not required for properties within a dam inundation zone. As of today, flood insurance is not required. And the maps are mainly used for emergency action planning, but also, of course, for real estate disclosure. So in the past, we have had some dam failures, but the good news is we learn from mistakes we make. We have a lot of really good engineers in our country, and all over the world, really, that go into, we take mistakes that happen in our country and everywhere else, and improve on those things. So in the upper left, there was a dam in Idaho that failed in 1976. It was made out of material that eroded really easily. So no longer are dams made of that type of that earth and dam material. Upper right corner was San Francisco Dam, San Francisco Creek, St. Francis Dam in 1928 that was built. The plans for the dam changed at the last minute to lengthen the height of the dam, to increase the height of the dam. And the engineerings weren't copacetic because the base of the dam needed to be widened, and it never was. And so there was some slope issues and soil issues, and combined with the faulty design of the dam, it did fail. And unfortunately, 420 people perished in that dam failure. That occurred what is now Santa Clarita and parts of Ventura County, like Piru and Fillmore and communities like that, that were inundated with that dam failure. And in the lower right, there was a near collapse of San Fernando Dam in the 1971 Silmar earthquake. And so that had to be repaired. It was a near catastrophic event. So we do learn from our mistakes, but again, this is something that is it changes. There's a lot of changes going on because about every 3 or 4 months, the state will update a whole new set of maps for us to implement into our reports. So the next two zones are fire zone related. One is the very high fire zone and the other is the wildland area. This is one thing that we cover on our hot topic updates, is changes going on with fire zones, is the passage of AB 38, Assembly Bill 38, that has to do with the fire hardening disclosure. And what fire hardening has to do with is protecting your home in the event of a wildfire. And the way you can best do that is defensible space clearance around the perimeter of the home, like clearing out brush and trees and things like that. The other thing is fire resistant building materials such as roofing and siding, and then also improving your eaves and soffits so embers won't get into the attic. So these are things that are required to disclose now from a seller to a buyer if they're in a high or very high fire hazard severity zone. So it's not a point of sale disclosure, meaning it doesn't have to be, it's not like improvements have to be made to the home prior to close of escrow. It just, they have to provide information to the buyer on what the buyer can do to improve their home in the event of a wildfire. So now, as far as the disclosures go, like I said, there's two. One is a state, a very high fire zone. This has to do with usually incorporated cities, so areas where you have a lot of people living, so the high dwelling density is higher. And then you would also have areas that are weather is conducive to wildfire, where you have a lot of vegetation, steep areas, so steep topography, and the climate is right. So those areas like the Oakland Hills, this came about because of the 1991 Oakland Hills firestorm, and legislation was passed to start disclosing the very high fire hazard severity zones. So the other one is a state responsibility, where these are more rural areas, like unincorporated county areas, up in the mountainous areas, forested grassland, could be brushland. So these are what are called SRA or wildland areas. And so what it means to a buyer, basically, the difference between the fire zones are, one is more rural, one is more urban. So response times can be much greater for fire crews to show up to the property in the SRA and the unincorporated county areas. So there's that level of risk as well. The compliance is similar. So the fire, any kind of new roofing that, if you live in these areas, has to be fire resistant type roofing, and the brush clearance is going to be required. So, but again, the difference between AB 38, those are the high and very high zones, as opposed to this disclosure, which is the very high zones. So
Ted, if I can you go back a couple screens to where the disclosure is?
This right
This
here?
one, yes.
Yeah.
So for that disclosure, we do have a form that talks about home fire hardening disclosure.
Yeah,
And
that's the HHDS form, right?
yep. So that is if we see it on just the top one, right? A very high fire severity zone. Is that what's applicable to AB 38?
Yeah, I was it's a great question because I was just going to get into the problem right now is that the maps that the state provides, and that's CAL FIRE, they show very high. So if it's checked yes for very high, then yes, definitely that would be. But we don't know if it's a high zone. That's the problem right now. And the state is supposed to come out with a set of maps this spring. So it could be any time that show high and very high because the maps were provided by the state. They only show the very high for the local zones. The wildland area, even though it's checked yes in this situation, that could be moderate, high, or very high. So again, we don't know if it's very high, high, or moderate. It could be moderate, then that disclosure requirement doesn't trigger. So the way CAR has worded that form is that they make it really nebulous. They say anytime you're in a forested area or how do they phrase it? I think they say mountainous or forested area or where there's a lot of trees and stuff, that form should be provided. So basically, if you're in a hillside area, it's a good idea to provide that CAR form. So
okay, yeah, and I'm sorry, I was reading the car form. I have it up with me. So I remember hearing from, I think another natural hazard disclosure company where they said they actually have on their form something that says, this does trigger the AB 38 disclosure. But from what you're saying, it almost sounds like that's not going to be accurate because
well,
you don't have the
see,
high maps.
there are maps from 2005 that do show these zones, but they're 15 years out of date because they don't correspond to the newer set of maps that come out. Those maps that I think they're using are yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
There's very little guidance from the state and CAR on this because there's a lot of liability. We don't want to be wrong and provide maps because the maps technically aren't available. There are some out there that are really old and there were what they were called in the phase. There were draft maps that showed the old, very high fire hazard severity zones of high zones. So again, I didn't want to ever use those because they were never approved and they were never official. But hopefully, the Cal Fire has said that they're going to come out with these maps sometime this spring, and then we can do the high and very high disclosure accurately.
Right. The concern is that as we're filling out these forms, the disclosure does say it is or is not in a high or very high fire hazard form. I mean, fire
Right.
hazard zone. And it sounds like there's no way to really know that. I mean, definitely
Right.
if you're in a mountainous area and it says yes for both or something, I would probably just go ahead and say it is in the fire hazard zone.
Yeah, it's safe to do that.
Right, but that's almost safer but I think there are even like city areas where you don't necessarily think it's in a fire hazard zone, but it is. And
Yeah,
to state that
we
it's
do.
not is a bit of a risk. So,
Yeah, I know. It's not surprising that legislation gets passed, but another agency doesn't even know what's going on. It's kind of a mess right now. But the way some agents, some real estate agents are and brokers are just saying, fill out the form for every report until we know for sure.
right, so we will do the form, but on the form it says it is or it isn't in a fire zone. So do you
Right.
just say?
You would. I would. Wasn't there a box that says they're not sure or to the best of their no?
Hold on, I can call it up actually.
Yeah,
So, let's see. It says the home, it just says the home is, or if checked, is not in a high or very high fire hazard severity zone.
Yeah, that's a
So,
problem.
yeah, I mean, it doesn't say, like, I wish if they had one that just said, I'm not sure, I think that would make sense, but
Yeah, I know.
it doesn't, well, I won't share, but it
Right.
actually says, it just says it is or it isn't. And there's
Yeah.
no, I'm not sure, it might be, or something to that effect.
Right.
Or
Right.
to the homeowner's knowledge, it is, or it doesn't
Right.
say that
Right. It doesn't say that.
per
Yeah,
se,
and it
so,
should. It really should,
okay.
because yeah, there's no way to know for sure. To be honest with you, so I mean, you can be safe and just say it is.
And just leave it
But
blank.
that yeah, and write an addendum, I
Well,
guess.
this slide you have up here right now, that's part of your report, right?
Right, and this is part of the
So,
statutory. Oh, yeah, this is
so
part of the statutory form.
if it's checked no on very high fire severity zone. So Gene, why wouldn't we just check it no?
Because it could be
Or
a
have our
high,
client check it? No?
because
Yeah,
what-
because it could still be a high
High.
zone. It could be a high, very
Higher zone.
Okay, well, your
fire.
form says a very high, and our form says just high.
No, it has to be a high or very high zone. That's what our form says. So
Right.
according to Ted, they don't have up-to-date maps on the high fire zone,
Correct.
Okay,
in which case it could say no here for the very high, but it could still be in a high fire zone.
Right.
And if you check it is not in a high fire zone, on your form, and then it turns out that it is, that's not
Yeah,
accurate. So,
problematic. Yeah.
problematic.
And you could still be yes for a wildland area, but it'd be in a moderate zone, and then the disclosure requirement would not apply. I mean, it's safe to say yes if it's checked yes for state, then to obviously provide the form for the wildland area, provide the form. But most properties, and you're in where are you in San Bruno area?
We're in San Mateo County.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So very few properties are going to be in a wildland area unless you're listing property like in Woodside or maybe Emerald Hills, like Redwood City.
Mhm.
Where else? La Honda, Pescadero, areas like that. That's where you're going to find the wildland areas. Okay. Okay, so let's see. The next. Oh yeah, this is talking about local fire zones as opposed to state fire zones. So every NHD report we do, we're looking at maps that are adopted by city and county agencies. So, for example, city of Santa Rosa here in the red zones, those are the state very high zones. But in the city level maps, you have wildland urban interface zones, which are considered hazardous areas as well. And then city of Hayward, for example, these are areas of fire class of moderate, high, and very high that they have adopted. So you have the state areas that are very high, but the county areas of high and moderate. So again, so they have access to some of that state data that might be out of date, but that's still adopted by the city in that case. So again, you would know by a high zone, then that would be an example to use that form on a city level. So the next zone are earthquake faults and basically how they're formed. In a crash course geology lesson, there's the theory of plate tectonics that's important to understand when you're dealing with earthquakes, because the globe is made up of puzzle pieces, essentially called plates. And those plates have boundaries, and that's where a lot of the major earthquakes occur on our planet. So this is what's called the Ring of Fire around the Pacific Ocean, where most of the strongest earthquakes happen along this plate boundary. And the San Andreas Fault that runs right through California here is actually a plate boundary between the North American Plate and the Pacific Plate, and that's why the San Andreas Fault is considered such a major fault. And again, that's where you have a lot of major earthquakes. And also tsunamis would occur because of the fact that you have these undersea shift in plates during earthquakes, and that's where you can have water um, be displaced and cause tsunamis because of undersea earthquakes. So basically, when you look at the San Andreas Fault from above, it's in Kern County. You can see it clearly right here, and then right in our backyard, San Andreas Crystal Springs Reservoir is the actual trace of the San Andreas Fault that runs right along 280 right here, and of course you have Hillsborough and Millbrae and Pacifica up in Pacifica's right over here. And so you have the San Andreas Fault that runs right through here and up into Marin County. Whoops. So the importance of earthquake disclosure, earthquake fault disclosure. Again, this is legislation after the 1971 Silmar earthquake in San Fernando Valley. 65 people lost their life, and there were a lot of hospitals damaged and the near collapse of a dam. And so they passed the Alcatraz Special Studies Zone Act in 1972. And this really changed building codes in the state of California, because what they determined is that no longer would homes be allowed to be built right on top of faults. It's not like they were allowed to before, it just they weren't studied before in the 70s. And so a lot of homes, there were no building restrictions because of earthquake faults. Well, that all changed after these maps passed, because the whole idea is that you can build in a fault zone, but you cannot build on top of a fault or within 50 feet of an earthquake fault, because this is what would happen during a major earthquake, is where you have offset of the soil. Here's the earthquake fault right through here. You can actually have land slip past each other or thrust up from land that would be thrust up during a major earthquake. So you either have a strike slip fault where the land slides past each other, or a thrust fault earthquake where you have the land actually separate vertically. So this is what they're trying to prevent, is the construction of any structures right on top of any active faults.
Something to be said for a split level home right there.
Yeah, that's a good one. Split level. So when you take a closer look at these earthquake fault zone maps, the areas that are in the lightest color, those are outside of the fault zone. The tan area or light brown, that is the actual fault zone of the Hayward Fault right through Fremont. With the black lines are the actual trace of the Hayward Fault. So that's where you would expect the rupture to happen during a major earthquake along the Hayward Fault. Now, we have earthquakes along the Hayward Fault like every week, almost on a daily basis, but a lot of them are imperceptible. They're, 1.0, 2.0 earthquakes that we don't feel. But it's the major earthquakes that are in the 6 and 7 range where you're going to sustain damage and possible ground rupture. And so 1868 is the last time there was a major earthquake on the Hayward Fault that experienced ground rupture. That's why it's dated like that, because they can actually literally dig a trench in the ground and look into the offset in the soil and see and actually age date that to find out when it last ruptured. Now, we do have records that go back to 1868, so we know the date and time that that earthquake occurred. But even historically, when you go back thousands of years, geologists can age date those samples as well to find out when the last time that ruptured prior to 1868.
Do they know the scale of that 1868 earthquake?
Yeah, it was in the 7 point something range. Now the problem is that it caused a lot of damage in the Bay Area, even though we weren't that heavily populated. But a lot of the records were destroyed because they didn't want people to be scared to move to the Bay Area, because this is right after the gold rush and right when there was a lot of people immigrating to the Bay Area. So they didn't want the negative news out there. So a lot of the data and information was destroyed from that, but it was in the 7.0, similar to the Loma Prieta earthquake in that range. So one thing is that these maps, they don't delineate ground shaking. So they're not depicting whether or not ground shaking would be stronger in this area rather than this area. It's only defining the potential for ground rupture, so the ground to actually fracture in these fault zones. So the primary intent is to prevent the construction of any properties on homes on top of these faults. Sometimes the zones are as narrow as 1,000 feet, but they can be wider. You can see where they have multiple fault traces in this area that the zone is actually a little wider through there. And then also the state, California Geological Survey, they continue to review these maps. They make updates, especially where there's recent earthquakes. So in Napa a couple years ago, we had a lot of new maps that came out in the West Napa Fault for that mapping of that fault that was not considered active through in the Napa area. And then we also are going to be expecting maps in the Ridgecrest area from about 2 years ago. There was July 4th earthquake in Ridgecrest. Those maps haven't come out yet. It usually takes the state a couple of years to, they're kind of understaffed right now, the Geological Survey, so it takes a couple of years before they release new maps. And the one key thing is that only active faults are shown on these maps. Faults can be divided into the category of active, potentially active, and inactive. And active faults are ones that have shown rupture in the past 11,000 years, which is considered modern geologic time. Potentially active faults are the window of 11,000 to 2 to 3 million years. And then inactive faults are really not considered hazardous. Those are faults that haven't moved in millions of years. So the thing is, again, we're going back to the local disclosures, and this is one thing that HomeGuard, we really do a great job at in our report, is disclosing local fault zones as opposed to just providing the state. All NHD companies are providing state level disclosure. Not all of them do local, and not all of them do it that well. We do it really well, very thorough. Every city in the state, we are looking at seismic maps that are adopted as part of their safety element in the general plan. So this is Walnut Creek. You have the Southampton Fault, you have a northern extension of the Calaveras Fault, and you have the Mount Diablo Fault. None of these faults in this area are shown as active because the state hasn't declared them to be active because it doesn't look like they've moved in several thousand years. But cities can still impose building restrictions if it's a potentially active fault, and many of them do. In the bottom left here, Los Altos Hills, probably prime real estate, average home probably what, $4 million. These are 3 faults: the Altamont, Baracal, and Monte Vista Fault. None of them are considered active by the state, but they are considered potentially active by the county and city. And I know for a fact that they do impose building restrictions in those fault zones. So the last thing you want to do is sell a $5 million property and provide an inexpensive NHD report that's not providing accurate local, city, and county level disclosure and not disclose that information. So this is just driving home the importance of local disclosure. And this is in Glendale in Southern California, where you have an extension of the Sierra Madre Fault. Sierra Madre Fault is considered active in some parts of LA County, but not this area, but it is shown on the city level maps, as well as a couple other faults, the Verdugo Canyon Fault, Mount Lucan's Fault. So just showing the importance of local disclosure. So what does it mean to a buyer for earthquake fault zones? Buying, whether it's an earthquake fault zone or close to one of these potentially active faults, that building restrictions could apply. And so you could have setbacks that are required, and that could be pretty costly to do the geotechnical work, because you're talking about hiring engineering geologists, you're talking about backhoes, digging trenches on the property. That adds up in the cost of getting permit approval for properties. So it's important that buyers understand the ramifications of buying in a fault zone. So the geologic analysis is what I was talking about, as far as having someone come out to the property, hiring engineering geologists, etc. And being in a fault zone doesn't mean a fault trace exists on the property. So you could still be like in the San Andreas fault zone and be 400 or 500 feet away from a fault. That doesn't mean you can't build there. It just means that you have to go through the necessary permit approval, but you can still build property in a fault zone, and even because you might not have a fault trace that close to the property. And as far as I touched on this earlier, shaking is a primary effect of an earthquake that can be stronger outside of the zone. So, for example, a great example here is the Loma Prieta earthquake, where you had liquefaction occur in parts of the Bay Area, Santa Cruz, Watsonville, Oakland, Marina District, and San Francisco. And those areas weren't even close to the fault zone, but they shook severely because of the soil type. And that is what liquefaction is. And we'll go into that in a second.
Do you have a sense of the cost for a geologic, if a buyer wanted to buy on a piece of property and wanted to renovate or what have you, and they were required to get a soils report? Do you have a sense of what that would
somewhere
cost?
between $10,000 to $20,000 in that scope. Yeah, it kind of depends on what the size of the project, really. I mean, if it's a vacant land, they may have to dig a few trenches on the property if it's in the fault zone, and then get that approval. And they have to write up a soils report as well, engineering report.
So what is the difference between a geological report and a soils report? I know a soils report is then they can use that to base, engineers will use that to base their calculation for the foundation, but what does a geological report do that the soils report doesn't?
Well, I guess they're very similar, I guess. If it's an engineering, it's pretty much the same.
Because a soils report would typically cost about $3,000-4,000. So for a geologic report to cost 15 to 20, it has to be something different there.
Sure, but if you're looking at a soils report where you're testing the type of the soil or checking the stability of a hillside, you're not trenching and you're not digging trenches on the property. So, right. So that's where costs get involved of that work, because you're talking about, and they're literally digging 10-foot trenches and then backfilling it too. So there's that cost that's involved. Whereas, you can do a hillside study and you're not doing that type of work. You're looking at, or even, retaining wall, analyzing a retaining wall, things like that. So,
okay, thank you.
Yeah, there's different types of engineering reports that can be done. So, and it also depends if it's vacant or if there's existing home, and then you're looking at, what is causing that cracking in the concrete, or what's causing these doors not to close properly. So, yeah. Okay, so the next zones to talk about were the seismic hazard zones. So these were maps that were introduced after the Loma Prieta earthquake, and the two zones to talk about were landslides and liquefaction zones. Now everybody knows what landslides are. We have those every year, of course, when it rains, but you can also have seismic induced landslides because of ground shaking during an earthquake. Most landslides occur because you have wet soil and gravity takes over, and then you can have mud flows or landslides. Liquefaction, basically the easiest way to describe liquefaction is a quicksand-like effect that can take place in the soil. Now, three things have to exist for liquefaction to occur. you have to have an earthquake, so you have to have strong ground motion. You have to have soil that is saturated or very near surface, high groundwater levels, so you need water. And then you also need the soil that's conducive towards liquefaction, such as sandy soil, bay mud type soil, silty soil. So clay soils typically are not going to liquefy, but when you have soil that is the bay mud, sandy soil, those conditions, if all three of those conditions are present, the water, the ground shaking, and the soil type, then that's where you have liquefaction occur. So basically what it means to a buyer is that you can have weak rock and soil under the property and they can fail during an earthquake. And the thing is, you can always grade and construct around liquefaction and landslide hazards. So, that's again where you get into building requirements. Most homes that are that are built in the Bay Area and California, because we're already in the highest building codes in this part of in California. So the building codes are already stringent enough where they're going to require wood frame and anchor bolts around the perimeter of the foundation to make sure that homes won't slide off the foundation. So the thing is that it's the older homes that we have to also worry about too, because those might not be properly bolted to the foundation. They may be made out of building materials that might not do well during an earthquake as well. So it's not necessarily where you are in relation to earthquake faults, but also the soil that you're sitting on and the structural integrity of the home. So all those things have to be evaluated when you're assessing how well will my home be during an earthquake? How well will it do during an earthquake? So this, yeah.
Sorry. So if the buyer is considering buying a property and then it comes out that it is in a liquefaction zone, and it is an older home, what would be the I mean, do they just forget about it, or look at possibly shelling out a lot of money?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it really depends how old the home is and what it's made from. I mean, you're not going to find brick homes in the Bay Area. I mean, very few. You might have some that are over 100 years old, like in the Berkeley Hills or Oakland or parts of Hayward, but very few homes are going to be made out of that type of building material. And just because you're in a liquefaction zone, it doesn't necessarily mean liquefaction will occur, because based on this map, this is like around downtown San Jose, which most of this area is not made out of bay mud. None of it is really bay mud material that's going to sustain major damage during an earthquake. These are just general areas where you have higher groundwater tables. So you might have two of those three conditions exist where you might need a very severe earthquake, a great earthquake, in order for liquefaction to occur. Whereas in Foster City, Redwood Shores, those areas, you just need, you have all three conditions present. You have the liquefaction prone soil, you have the earthquake source nearby, and you do have high groundwater levels. So the state maps, they're really pretty generalized. You're either saying yes or no. You're either in or out. And that is on the local level. Again, I'm going back to we're showing the fire zones and the fault zones. That's also true for liquefaction hazards, because some maps that we use, for example, County San Mateo, they're showing 3 zones. They're showing not in, they're showing low, actually 4 zones: not in, low, moderate, and high. So, and even some cities.
For seismic, are you talking about for seismic?
I'm talking about for liquefaction hazards. Yeah.
Okay. Specifically, liquefaction.
Right. And so for when we do, even more so, like in City of San Mateo, on those maps, I think they show 6 different zones of liquefaction. Same with San Carlos. So it really depends on what city you're in. That's going to show what maps that they have available. But we're doing liquefaction disclosures on the state, city, and county level, and so a lot of times they're different. You might be out for the state, but be in a moderate zone for a city. You could be in for the state and be in a moderate zone for the city. So it doesn't mean that one map is right and one map is wrong. They're just showing, like I said, the state maps are real simple. You're either in or you're out, but the city and county maps, in a lot of cases, there might be 4, 5, or 6 different liquefaction zones. So,
and your report always has city, county, and state in it.
It does, but like, for example, if we're doing a report in Millbrae, that they show a fault zone that's called the Sarah Fault that runs through the hills in Millbrae. That's not considered active. But there are that's all the city of Millbrae maps show. They don't show liquefaction zones. Burlingame does, if I remember correctly. They just came out with the new general plan last year, and I believe their maps even show sea level rise, area that could be impacted by sea level rise. That would be areas like right along Highway 101, I believe. And I'm trying to remember. I can't think of all of them right now, but all new general plans that come out and safety elements, they're required to address sea level rise. So when you have properties that are on the perimeter of the bay, that would be addressed. Like the next time City of Millbrae updates their general plan, that will be something that will be on the maps. So going on away from seismic or natural hazards, airport influence areas took effect in 2004, and these are areas around runways of airports that would be disclosed as basically a nuisance. I mean, obviously living in Millbrae and San Bruno, South San Francisco, and Burlingame, you're aware of SFO. And there's an additional disclosure that the San Mateo County Association of Realtors put together in certain cities. I believe it's South San Francisco, Pacifica, San Bruno, and Millbrae, where there is an additional 6-page disclosure that we provide. It kind of has to do with soundproofing and older homes that can be the soundproofing paid for by the airport if it's an issue. So
when you say we provide this extra 6-page report, you mean you guys do? In your report, you provide it?
Correct. We'll put that. It will go after the NHD report, but before the tax report and environmental report. We'll insert that. It's a PDF of 6 or 7 pages that is required to disclose. So
and it's just included in there, so it's not. It's always included in there, so you just don't. Right. It's not a separate report that you see.
Correct. It's all part of the one PDF altogether. So if we're doing the report in San Carlos, it's not going to be included. It's only included for the cities in which it's required. So that is the airport influence areas. Other disclosures are right to farm and mining operations. So these are basically nuisance related issues. So if you're living within a mile of farmland, which rarely are we ever doing that any longer, but sometimes you might have some area that's zoned as agriculture, especially in grassland areas. In Half Moon Bay, there's quite a few. There's still a lot of farming going on there. So that would basically mean to a buyer is that, there may be negative impacts such as dust, odors, herbicide or pesticide use, machinery operation, noise, commercial traffic, also living near mines, that they just have to understand that that's the negative impacts of living near these areas. So they really don't have a right to change anything because those farmers have a right to farm and there's some mining operations going on near that property. So they basically, it's something that a buyer has to understand when they're moving into that area that they have to kind of deal with and be aware of. Formula use defense sites. So these are areas that were once owned and operated by the Department of Defense where they may have left behind unexploded ordnance. So we do have quite a few of these in the Bay Area. Most of them are in Southern California, but along the San Francisco coastline, there were a lot of former batteries and seacoast defense sites. Fort Funston, for example. There are a couple along the other San Mateo coastline, Daly City area. So basically, actually, I remember reading a few years ago that a dog uncovered a live device that was used to. They did a lot of practice bombing during World War II along the cliffs there in Fort Funston. So a dog was actually dug up a live explosive left over from many years ago. So so sometimes it happens, and buyers have to be aware that if you're living within a mile of any of these sites, that gets disclosed as well. Gas and hazardous liquid pipeline. I'm sure we all remember the San Bruno pipeline disaster, and that triggered a statewide disclosure requirement. And the disclosure requirement is basically that link that we have there. It's the public map viewer. So if buyers are concerned where these pipelines are, they can use that link. And there's also a paragraph that gets put into the NHD report. But they can click on that link and go to the state National Pipeline Mapping System site, and they can view on a map. You'd select the state, you'd select the county, and you would get a map. And you can zoom in a little bit, and you can see where the three different types of pipelines. You have natural gas pipelines, then you also have liquid pipelines, and that could be jet fuel. It could also be crude oil pipelines as well. So a lot of the crude oil pipelines are in Solano County, Contra Costa County, where you have the refineries. SGMA, which is Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. This is not a hot topic if you're selling single family homes, but if you're ever listing property that's a ranch or agriculture purposes, this is a real big deal for buyers because there is now restrictions on how much groundwater they have access to. It's more regulated in the drought years rather than right now. We have pretty wet winters recently, so we're not in a drought, but I'm sure we will be again in a few years. That's just the way it is in California. So it's basically trying to control the amount of subsidence that occurs, because when groundwater gets extracted, you can have the land actually subside a little bit if groundwater doesn't get replenished through aquifers and rainwater and snow runoff, things like that. So that's SGMA. So everything I just talked about was part of the NHD report. The other report we offer and NHD companies offer is the environmental report. This will cover hazards such as known contaminants around the proximity of the property. So these would be leaking underground fuel tanks like gas stations. We do a half-mile search on that. And then we do a 1-mile search for anything non-fuel related. So that could be anything related to like a dry cleaner. It could be a Superfund site where there may be toxic materials from high-tech companies or landfills, things like that, where there's contamination of some sort. It could also be into the groundwater as well and actually migrate in the groundwater. So sometimes those underground plumes would be mapped as well. So that's the environmental report. There's no state law that says this information has to be disclosed, but the compliance is nearly like 95% of agents in the Bay Area will order the environmental report. It might even be higher than that, especially if you're using the PRDS form contract that requires environmental disclosure. So what did they say, Marlin?
They said that we're good, that they don't think it's going to cut off.
Okay, good.
Do your reports deal with endangered species at all?
Yeah, we do. We do provide a endangered species disclosure, but we don't get into which endangered species could be affected because it's an ever-changing thing of which species there are. We provide links, so if the buyer is concerned about an endangered species in their area, they can use that link and research that. Especially if they're going to buy vacant land, it's a good idea to do that, or if they're planning to add on to their existing home to do that, or even a tennis court, a deck, a swimming pool. It's a good idea to research that first as well. Because there could be, I mean, some companies pick like a red-legged frog or pot-bellied salamander or something like that. And there's about 50 or 60 different endangered species. So you can't really just pick one and not worry about anything else. If you're going to start picking one or two, you have to worry about everything. And then there's also the fauna too, the different types of trees or shrubs that you may not be able to cut down or dig out too. So it's yeah, we do provide the disclosure on that. It's kind of more of an advisory rather than a specific disclosure on any specific endangered species.
Thank you.
Okay. And then the last disclosure is our tax report. We do a really thorough job with our tax report because we're not only providing whether or not it's in a Mello-Roos district, but we also provide information about that district. So it could be a beginning and end date of the tax. It could be a maximum escalator because sometimes these Mello-Roos taxes can increase. And also a key issue is the accelerated foreclosure clauses that are associated with Mello-Roos taxes. And sometimes a homeowner can be foreclosed on in 90 to 180 days if they don't pay their Mello-Roos taxes. So if you're not familiar with the Mello-Roos taxes, they're taxes that go to fund infrastructure such as new schools, new police departments, fire departments, it can be middle schools, high schools, libraries, and you'll find the Mello-Roos districts in a lot of newer communities. So we may not have too many on the peninsula, but definitely in the Central Valley, you'll see a lot of Mello-Roos districts. There's a new community in San Ramon called Windermere, which is on the east side of San Ramon over the hills. And some of those homeowners are paying upwards of about $8,000 a year in Mello-Roos taxes. So, you know, they might have anticipated a $10,000 or $11,000 a year property tax, but when you tack on Mello-Roos in 1915 Bond Act assessments, they're paying well over $20,000 a year. So in some areas, this is a real hot topic. Like communities, some communities in San Mateo County have voter approved Mello-Roos, but they're really small taxes, maybe $20 or $30 a year, like a library tax. I know where I am in Sunnyvale, we pay a $30 a year Mello-Roos tax for county libraries, but you know that's not going to break the bank. But it's where you have these exorbitant Mello-Roos taxes where it's a real hot topic, and buyers really need to be aware of these taxes. We also provide a PACE disclosure in our tax report as well, the Property Assessed Clean Energy. This is a program that enables homeowners to finance solar or wind or energy efficient projects, could even be a gray water system, and get a really good rate on their loan. The thing is that if you're going through a PACE program, it becomes a tax on the property. And when it becomes a tax on the property, when you go to close escrow, the lender's going to want that paid off prior to close of escrow. It's a priority status lien. So that could really throw a whole wrench into the loan process if the seller has a PACE loan. So if you see a seller, if you're representing a seller and you know that they have solar or anything energy efficient going on with the home, you need to check with them to make sure they don't have a PACE loan, because if they do, they're probably going to need to pay that off prior to close of escrow, or at least negotiate with the buyer on how to get that taken care of and paid off. So this is a real big issue in Riverside County, San Bernardino County, Sacramento, Santa Rosa area, where there's a lot of PACE loans in those communities.
So all PACE loans need to be cured before this before property can transfer.
That's I hear a lot of stories that is the case. Correct.
That's
But
what I
again,
think. thought, but I wasn't 100%
Yeah,
sure.
it's like when the lender, that's when, that's when the agents get involved and negotiate and work with the lender to find solutions, because sometimes the seller might not have the funds to pay off that loan prior to close of escrow. Maybe they have to reduce the price, the cost of the home, and then have the buyer take care of it. So it's all that negotiating and working and sleepless nights that you guys have sometimes, and to
Are,
handle these things that come up.
right, are the PACE loans, so they are assumable? It seems like they are, but it's just that you have to go through that whole process of the buyer. Even if they're willing, they need to apply and qualify and
Yeah, and again, it's up to the lender though, because the lender is going to want
what the terms are.
that lien cleared before close of escrow.
Yeah.
In most cases.
I didn't know that the PACE loans were assumable.
It's, I mean,
Well, theoretically, you would think they would be, but you're saying that the buyer would just take over the loan?
right, even in here in your notes, you say complications if the buyers don't want to take over the lease. So it sounds like there is that option. I know
Yeah,
I have two situations. I think it's important if they have solar panels, just to ask, is
Yeah.
it leased or owned? And if it's leased, I've been just getting the paperwork for the lease just to see what the terms are. And actually, two of my upcoming listings, the sellers just decided to pay it off because it's easier
Yeah.
to do that. But that means you have to have that money, and it's not.
Right. And it could be $35,000. You never know. So
Yeah.
But Gene, our contracts car contracts, they have to, there's a place where they have to divulge whether they have any leased items, right?
Right, so you would say on there whether it's leased or not, and then it does come up in the prelim, even
Yeah.
if there's a lien on the property, so, but that's good to get in front of instead of waiting for later, to try to figure out what our alternatives are.
Yeah, and it's important to keep on top of all the new things going on. Even yesterday, there were new flood maps for City of San Francisco released, and there were never any flood zones in the city of San Francisco before until yesterday. There was always out of a flood zone, but now they released new maps. Basically, the area around the perimeter of the bay that might be subsequent hazardous to sea level rise would be put into a flood zone around city of San Francisco. Also changed in this past year, parts of South San Francisco, parts of Millbrae and South San Francisco, San Bruno, and even like Alameda and San Leandro because of sea level rise as well. So those flood maps have changed too. So yeah, it's important to keep on top of, even if you're a landlord, it's now required to disclose to tenants if they're in a flood zone or dam inundation zone too. So that's something new that passed a year and a half ago. So the disclosure requirement.
The sea level rise information, how is that formatted?
Well, usually the counties and cities are adopting information from the Pacific Institute. I don't have the website off the top of my head, but Pacific Institute, and they did a lot of different studies, and it's really confusing because they provide a lot of different scenarios. Whether it's a 55 millimeter increase, or how do they say it, or centimeter, I guess it would be, increase to 80, and it's based on how many years down the road, 80 years or 50 years or 40 years. So they have a lot of different scenarios, and then a city will essentially adopt one of those and provide that information in their map. Sometimes even City of Novato, when they updated their general plan, they provided two different scenarios. So, and they can also they also have one with if there's a storm surge in addition to sea level rise, what impacts that could be as well. So it gets pretty complicated, but the cities will tend to pick one scenario and adopt that on their maps.
It's going to be a big item as we go forward.
Well, hopefully it won't, but it's something that the cities and counties are required to address per state legislation. So,
But right now it's just incorporated in the flood, in terms of flood.
no, it's a
disclosure,
separate
or-
disclosure.
It is a
So,
separate.
separate disclosure because flood insurance. But what is happening is that FEMA is reacting to it as well. So they are updating their flood maps in relation to potential sea level rise. So, and this would be for properties that are very, very low elevation. So, like I said, like City of Alameda and Bay Farm Island, which is kind of like Foster City. There's a lot of lagoons and things around City of Alameda. So those homes that were adjacent to those lagoons, inland lagoons, which are saltwater lagoons, they would be essentially in a flood zone now because they would anticipate, I don't know how many feet rise of sea level. Now, Foster City got put into a predicament last couple of years. They said that FEMA said that we're going to put your entire city in a flood zone unless you pass this $80 million bond act for levies to be raised. So there's already a levy system around Foster City, but Army Corps of Engineers and FEMA was saying it's not to the standards that it needs to be to protect against storm surge or sea level rise. So the cities, the residents of Foster City were kind of in a situation where, well, do we pay, have our taxes go up $250 a year to pay for this bond act, or do we just pay flood insurance? And it passed where their taxes have gone up, but they're funding a improvement to the levy system as opposed to having to pay flood insurance.
But isn't that a Mello-Roos cost, not a property tax cost?
No, it wasn't a Mello-Roos, so it's not
You'd
a
think it
Mello-Roos
would
tax.
be. It's a what?
It was a voting issue. No, it wasn't.
It's probably
Yeah,
just a bond.
a bond. Yeah, so everyone's taxes went up in Foster City. So they kind of, you're kind of, it's one thing or the other. You're paying a couple $100 a year in taxes, or you're paying well over $1,000 a year in flood insurance. So kind of an easy decision in that case. But
Especially
again,
if you're paying the $250 to make improvements. So you're
right.
not just paying $1,000 for flood insurance.
Right. So Foster City does have that levy system to protect them, whereas some communities they don't, like Alameda. So that's our presentation for today.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Ted,
Yes,
thank
thank
you,
you.
sweetheart.
This was
Thank
Very-
you.
Okay,
guys.
thanks everybody.
Very good. Very well
Okay.
done. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.